Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope that the election fever has subsided, and I know that some of you are experiencing a degree of anxiety, but nevertheless, life still needs to move forward, and so we also need to do something uh, about our studies, and wag po nating pabayaan to. And for this week, we will be discussing the digestive system. So I felt it convenient, or I would say uh, most appropriate to conduct this lecture asynchronous, to at least give some time for those who are experiencing uh, a slight state of depression as a result of the election, so that if ever you are already well and enough to read or to view this recording, then you may do so in your most convenient time. So the digestive system is also one of those very important function of the body in terms of providing nourishment through mechanisms that allows the body to assimilate food that is taken from or by the organism. So let me proceed further. In summarizing the functions of the digestive system, we have several of them. Of course, to follow the sequence of events beginning from the time that the food is introduced into the body, this all begins in the process called ingestion, where it also involves the primary activity of eating your food. And while the food is still in the oral cavity or the mouth, digestion already begins because several substances are secreted that facilitates the beginning of digestion. Foremost is the release of water to dissolve further larger portions of the food, enzymes that are designed to break down carbohydrates and proteins, and also buffers that protects the lining of the oral cavity from substances that tend to be acidic or basic, and in so doing neutralizes them. Um, as soon as the next stage by which food then travels is upon swallowing, where it is now going through the different places along the gastrointestinal tract. And what happens during this movement is that there is further mixing of the food and propulsion through a process described as peristalsis that is facilitated by smooth muscles situated along the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. And the next stage would be digestion, which is the actual breakdown of food that is accomplished mechanically and accompanied by chemical breakdown. Mechanical breakdown involves the movement of the digestive organs, particularly how the stomach moves in a movement described as churning. While chemical is an activity or breakdown of food facilitated by digestive enzymes. There are various enzymes secreted not only by the stomach but also by other accessory organs like the pancreas as well as portions of the small intestine. And when the food is already broken down to its smallest particle, small enough for it to be absorbed by the walls of the digestive tract, this process is called absorption. And it is soon followed by assimilation, wherein the nutrients actually became assimilated in the blood and further utilized by the cells who actually utilizes these nutrients. And for those portion of the food that have not been utilized by the digestive system, turns out as waste and is eventually eliminated uh, through the process called defecation, which is the dumping of waste products. And well, typically it moves through out of the anus. There are several organs of the digestive system. Foremost would be the gastrointestinal tract, and this is basically a tube where it runs from the mouth going to the anus. No, in well, generally speaking, if we're referring to the gastrointestinal of higher, lower, as well as higher forms, the more generic term will be the alimentary tract. But as the organism becomes more complex, it now the word gastrointestinal tract becomes more appropriate. Is the more appropriate term to describe this organ. So it is the tube where food passes through and where digestion and absorption occur. And this includes the mouth or the oral cavity, the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. Another group of digestive organs are classified as accessory organs. They are called as such because they are not situated along the gastrointestinal tract, but they also help in digestion, but this is where the food never passes. It includes the teeth, tongue, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. So if you want to see how or the position, relative position of the different digestive organs are in the digestive system, they are graphically depicted in the picture that you see on the screen. Now, uh, we will be somehow you will wonder, what is the gastrointestinal tract made up of? And if you're going to get a portion of the gastrointestinal tract and cut it in cross section, ah, it will reveal that wall, the wall of the tract is actually made up of four layers. Beginning from the innermost, pinakaloob. It is lined, the inner wall of the gastrointestinal tract is lined with epithelial mucosa. And uh, the type of epithelial tissue would vary from one place to another. For example, in the in the region of the oral cavity, as far as the esophagus, the lining is made up or is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. Uh, in fact, to complete the description, it is described as the mucosa. No? Generally, it's called the mucosa, and its complete description is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's non-keratinized, therefore, it's not like the skin. Unlike the skin, which is dry, the mucosa is moist. But as soon as you reach the vicinity of the stomach, the epithelial lining, the walls of the stomach, is becomes different. It would be lined by a single layer. It's already simple uh, columnar epithelium. And you will wonder why there is a difference because of the acidity in the environment of the stomach. If you have heard of certain gastric disorders that are associated with the condition called as heartburn, where it is characterized by pain in the chest region that seems to simulate a heart attack. It is because the acid content of the stomach is rising up, and thus it is burning the walls of the esophagus, which is not typically designed to withstand the acid content of the stomach. To prevent this from happening, there is a sphincter, which is called the gastroesophageal sphincter, that prevents the stomach content from refluxing or going in the opposite direction. But there are certain conditions that somehow predisposes this condition to aggravate, such as when you are always overeating. You're eating in excess of what the stomach can accommodate. Second is that after eating a heavy meal, you always tend to lie down immediately and sleep it off, which is also an aggravating factor. And as we grow older, this condition becomes chronic in nature, which becomes more difficult to treat and manage. So, to avoid this disorder from developing early, please avoid this kind of activities or this situation. Now, when you reach the vicinity of the intestine, it remains a simple columnar epithelium all throughout the small and the large intestine, with certain differences with regards to how food and water is substances is food and water is secreted or absorbed, as well as secretion of different kinds of substances. So underneath the mucosa, which is the second layer from the innermost region, would be the submucosa, where underlying this would be connective tissue, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and the enteric nervous system. Okay, it's a network of nerve fibers that uh, that are scattered along the walls of the gastrointestinal tract. That's the reason why sometimes with the sight of something that is so gross or something that is very repulsive to our eyes, why is it that we vomit as a response? Is because of the direct influence of the nervous system, a direct influence of the gastrointestinal tract to the nervous system. The third layer would be the muscularis layer. It's smooth muscle. And there are actually two layers. First would be the inner one. And if you will use your imagination, if this is the smooth muscle, circular, what happens when it contracts is that, di ba, nagko-constrict siya. While the outer longitudinal layer, which is pahaba, pag nagko-contract naman siya, umiiksi. No, it shortens. And this rhythmic or harmonious movement between the inner circular muscle and the outer longitudinal muscle is actually what creates the peristaltic effect. Diba? Yung peristaltic effect. Why food is able to move along the gastrointestinal tract. And although the gastrointestinal tract in this region are predominated by smooth muscles, there are still some places along the gastrointestinal tract that remain skeletal or voluntary in nature, such as those in the mouth, in the pharynx, as well as the upper esophagus, and the external anal sphincter, wherein it helps you somehow prevent from defecating when you are in an undesirable situation. And the outermost layer would be the serosa, no? The pinakalabas. It's a visceral layer of peritoneum. Ito yung tinatawag nating fascia that wraps around, no, the gastrointestinal tract. And furthermore, it creates further extensions called the greater omentum and mesentery. And this is another graphic depiction of the layers of the gastrointestinal tract. Let's try to rename it. First, ito yung mucosa. Parang hindi nag-gumagana yung aking battery. Okay. First, this is the mucosa. Then the middle is the serosa or submucosa. Then the next layer would be second layer is the submucosa. The next layer would be the smooth muscle. Ito, the smooth muscle. And the, hindi pala. Parang ulitin natin na. Nalito ako dun na. Okay, ulitin natin. So, unang-una yung mucosa. Yung mucosa. This is the epithelium. Then, the next layer would be the submucosa. Ito siya. And situated within this submucosa is ito, a layer of muscularis mucosa. Tapos meron tayong over the submucosa will be the muscle, the circular muscle, as well as the longitudinal muscle. Then, ito yung pinaka-outermost, which is the serosa or relatively the fascia. And furthermore, extensions of the serosa will reveal further a wide expanse of greater omentum that allows the gastrointestinal tract to be suspended. No? It's not really directly attached to the abdominal or the dorsal cavity wall, but it's actually hanging. And what facilitates this hanging or suspended nature of the gastrointestinal tract is the greater omentum. And it is also in this region where fats are stored, especially when one is fond of eating so much food that the excess nutrients are stored in the form of fats. Okay, having the greater omentum removed will reveal uh, much of the relative position of the gastrointestinal tract, showing regions as parts of the, the transverse colon, the descending colon, although the ascending colon was actually obscured largely by the small intestine, and from the descending colon we had the sigmoid going to the the rectum and eventually the uh, anus or anus. Now let's trace where food passes along the gastrointestinal tract, and it begins in the mouth or the oral cavity. It is formed by the cheeks and the tongue, the hard palate anteriorly, and in the back portion, it is walled by the soft palate. There is the overhanging uvula, which is a U-shaped extension of the soft palate posteriorly. And what is the purpose of this is it blocks the entry of food or drink into the nasal cavity. So as you swallow, it moves up, blocking the entry to the nasal cavity, although accidents do happen that small pieces of food as well as liquid usually enters the nasal cavity which triggers a coughing reflex. Di ba napapaubo tayo, nasasamid na when these food particles enter the nasal cavity. Okay, on the bottom would be, or on the floor of the oral cavity would be the tongue. It is a muscular accessory organ, maneuvers food for chewing, and adjusts shape for speech and swallowing. Surprisingly, it is one of those exceptions of a skeletal muscle that is not directly attached to a bone. Diba? Kasi minsan magkakaroon tayo ng trivia eh. Ano bang muscle ang ano bang muscle ang hindi attached sa bone? Well, one would think it's the penis, but it's not really correct because the penis is not really a muscular organ. It is more of a vascular organ. And the reason why it becomes stiff and erect is when it fills up with blood to such a point that the pressure actually makes it hard and rigid. Okay, there are also tonsils at the base of the tongue. We call them the lingual tonsils, although there are also other tonsils in the region of the palate, kaya tinawag nating palatine tonsils sila. Okay, we have to know that an accessory organ in the oral cavity is the salivary gland. It is an exocrine gland because it contains ducts that empty into the oral cavity. There are actually um, three pairs of salivary glands. We have the parotid glands. This is the largest gland situated anterior to the ears, and it is where it becomes swollen when infected in a person who is suffering from the mumps or beke. Submandibular gland is in the floor of the mouth. It is medial and inferior to the mandible. And sublingual is inferior to the tongue and superior to the submandibular bone. With regards to its secretion, saliva is 99.5% water. It also contains an enzyme called salivary amylase that begins the initial digestion of starch. Only starch, no? Kumbaga, kung pag-uusapan natin, among the different food groups, namely carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleotides, which among these four actually are digested or is digested early in the digestive tract? And the answer is carbohydrates. And what helps in their early digestion is salivary amylase. And mucus and other solutes are also present. Usually, they improve the quality or enhance the property of the saliva. Okay, so this is the oral cavity, and if I'm going to share you what I know as a dentist, the oral cavity is actually divided in four quadrants. Okay, so meron tayong upper region which is called the maxillary, and the lower region which is the mandibular region. So when we're referring to the teeth in the upper region, we call them the maxillary teeth, and for the lower region, the mandibular teeth. And when classifying or when upon dividing the oral cavity into four quadrants, we would designate the quadrants as 1, 2, 3, 4. So quadrant 1 is the right side of the patient. Quadrant 2 is the left maxillary region. Quadrant 3 is the right mandibular, and quadrant 4 is the left mandibular. If you want to know the designation of the tooth beginning from the central is 1. So this is the central incisor. So if you're referring to the right maxillary central incisor, the tooth designation would be 1, 1. The second one is the lateral incisor. That's why the right lateral maxillary incisor is 1, 2. The third one is the canine, kaya 1, 3 siya. The fourth one is the first premolar, it's 1, 4. The second premolar is 1, 5. The first molar is 1, 6. The second molar is 1, 7. And the third molar is 1, 8. That also goes with the other quadrants. Kunyari, what about the left side or the left maxillary region? Siyempre, kung central incisor sa left, 2, 1 siya. Kung lateral incisor, 2, 2. Kung kung K9, maxillary left K9, 2, 3, and so forth. Oh. Di ba simple lang? Yeah. So when you look at your dental chart and you see the numbers being written down by the dentist, this is the system that we are using to identify the tooth as well as its location. Well, the teeth is considered as an accessory organ because it is not where food is actually passes through or gets absorbed. And this is the hardest organ in the body, and it is embedded in bony sockets called alveolus along the mandible and axilla. There are three external regions, namely the crown, so which is the root and the neck. Meron ba tayong ano dito? Ayan. So this is the crown, the root, and this is the crown, the root, and the neck. And the crown is actually protected by the hardest substance in the human body called enamel. Ang enamel actually is the would be the most likely victim of dental caries or commonly called tooth decay. You know why? Because when the enamel is injured or destroyed, it is no longer replaced. Hindi naghi-heal ang enamel eh. The reason why meron tayong restorative dentistry or yung pinapastahan. we fill it up with an artificial fillings material. Underneath the enamel is dentin. Dentin is actually a live tissue. It's a living tissue because if the tooth decay reaches that part of the dentin, that is where you will experience pain because dentin is a very sensitive tissue. And as such, if it experiences pain, it means that the dentin is also capable of healing. Have you ever wondered that when you have a cavity and when pain starts to bother you, the pain will bother you for quite some time, then eventually it seems to disappear because there are times wherein the dentin was able to heal itself and the pain eventually subsided. But that will only be temporary as long as the cavity is still present. And that is the reason why it is advised for you to visit the dentist and have your cavity filled by the dentist. Now, underneath the dentin will be the pulp. uh, The pulp is actually a very sensitive tissue because it is where the nerves, blood vessels are situated. So once the tooth decay has reached the vicinity of the pulp, medyo masakit to, no? It's very excruciating. And that's the reason why one of the options to save the tooth from eventual removal is to have a root canal saan accessing the tooth from the cavity itself, the pulp will be removed so that the teeth loses its sensation and the space left by the pulp will be replaced by a substitute which would no longer render or make the pain sensitive to any kind of stimulus because you have already killed the pulp, have it removed, and filled it up with a filling material. Okay, we have to be aware that humans have two sets of teeth. The temporary teeth, as we all know it, is called deciduous teeth. So the first set actually number 20 teeth. And by the time you reach the age of 7, this 20 deciduous teeth will be gradually replaced by permanent teeth. And it happens from the age of 16 until the end of, uh, from 6 to 12 years. And these 6 to 12 years are actually called the ugly duckling stage. Kasi ito yung stage na ang temporary pati permanent teeth are both present. That's why the disparity between them two creates an ugly impression when a young person smiles. But as soon as the 20 deciduous teeth have all been removed, there will now be 32 permanent teeth. Meaning to say, out of the 32 permanent teeth, 20 are succedaneous. Meaning to say, etong 20 na to ang pumalit dun sa 20 uh, temporary teeth. The remaining 12 are actually non-succedaneous. Ibig sabihin, they appeared later because they did not succeed any of the 20 temporary teeth or deciduous teeth. And with regards to the classification of the teeth, as I described earlier, we have the incisors, the cuspids, the premolars, and the molars. Okay, while in the mouth, mechanical digestion happens when food is chewed and mixes it with saliva. where the end purpose is to form a soft bolus, no? Where kailangan medyo round yung digested food, which makes it easier for swallowing. Facilitating this is chemical digestion carried out by salivary amylase, which breaks down the starch or the polysaccharides into maltose and larger fragments. And digestion continues further in the stomach for about an hour until until the acid inactivates the amylase. Okay, so in the pharynx, as soon as the bolus has been swallowed, food passes from the mouth into the stomach. The swallowing of the food is voluntary. The person has to intentionally swallow the food. Um, and from the oropharynx, papasok na yung food sa esophagus, where the soft palate moves up, closing the nasal cavity, and the epiglottis moves down, guiding the food into the esophagus. Okay. And from the esophagus going to the stomach, the movement is accomplished through peristalsis. There are actually sphincters situated along the esophagus. An upper sphincter controls the entry into the esophagus, and a lower sphincter controls the entry into the stomach. If the lower esophageal sphincter begins to fail, that is where GERD begins to develop, which is called gastroesophageal reflux disease, kung saan nagba-backflow yung stomach content and burns the wall of the esophagus. Okay, so this is the graphic representation of the different parts of the pharynx and esophagus, as well as how peristalsis is accomplished by the esophagus, which facilitates the movement of food into the stomach. Now, as soon as the food enters the stomach, what is the stomach? It is a J-shaped enlargement of the gastrointestinal tract. And it's actually a mixing chamber and a holding reservoir, meaning to say the food stays here for quite some time until eventually it starts moving again through the small intestine. It is very elastic. That's why our s- our our tummy tends to swell as we grow older, expandable and muscular. And there are four regions of the stomach, namely the cardia, which surrounds the upper opening, the fundus, which is superior and left to the cardia, body, which is the large central portion, and the pylorus, which is the lower part, leading to the pyloric sphincter and duodenum. Okay, so ito yung ating, this is the graphic representation of the J-shaped stomach. Now, the interior portion of the stomach reveals uh, that the wall is not really smooth. The inner wall is not smooth because it is lined by what is called rugae of the mucosa or folds. This rugae of the mucosa actually is very evident in an empty stomach. But when the stomach fills up with food, the rugae tends to disappear because it facilitates the stretching. Kumbaga, 'di ba sa mga wrinkles, when an organ or when the skin is stretched, the wrinkles disappear. But once you release the pull, the wrinkles reappear again. Though that is the equivalent of the rugae along the inner wall of the stomach. The stomach wall or the gastrointestinal tract, as we would see, as we compare the layers that makes it up, beginning from the innermost layer of the stomach wall. It's called the mucosa. Okay, as I said, in when the stomach is empty, there are folds called rugae. The epithelium that lines the wall is simple columnar. There are many glands situated along the wall that secretes mucus as well as gastric glands, where certain parts of the stomach have depressions called gastric pits. And there are many secretory cells along the wall of the stomach. Foremost would be the mucus cell that secretes mucus. Okay, mucus actually helps protect the stomach wall from burning because where would the burning come? Because other cells like the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid as well as intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is actually a hormone that helps with vitamin B12 absorption needed for RBC formation. If you recall, 'di ba? Um pag may anemia, one of the anemia is caused by vitamin B12 deficiency as a result of the failure to secrete the intrinsic factor. And the type of anemia that develops in this case is pernicious anemia. Meaning to say, kaya hindi nag-absorb ng vitamin B12, may diferensya yung stomach. And we cannot solve the condition by increasing the dosage of vitamin B12 because even though you increase the dosage of vitamin B12, in the absence of intrinsic factor, the vitamin will never be absorbed at all. Kahit dagdagin mo pa yung dose ng vitamin B12. Dapat ang i-address mo yung intrinsic factor. Uh, and there are certain therapies to stimulate the parietal cells from secreting once again the intrinsic factor. Another group of cells are the chief cells that contains the inactive enzyme pepsinogen. Okay, however, this will eventually, once it is activated into pepsin, it helps in the breakdown of proteins. Another group of cells are the G cells that secrete gastrin or a hormone into the blood. Okay, the muscularis layer. Okay, kasi ang stomach, very muscular yan. And it contains three layers. The outer is the longitudinal. The middle is the circular muscle. And the inner is the oblique. Kaya aside from churning, yung oblique muscle, di ba? Parang pinipiga. Pinipiga. Kaya the churning effect actually helps break down muscles mechanically, efficient mechanical breakdown of food. And the outermost layer, which is the fourth layer, is the serous membrane lined with visceral peritoneum. Ito yung pinaka-fascia ng stomach. Extensions of the serosa will be the greater omentum that hangs from the curve of the stomach. And for the intestine, it's the mesentery that attaches it to the posterior wall of the abdomen and provides the route for blood vessels and nerve fibers. Kaya ang stomach also is suspended. It's not attached directly to any cavity wall. Okay, this is the graphic representation of the four layers. So ito yung innermost layer. From the innermost layer, which is the mucosa, the serosa is the outermost layer. So yung ito yung middle kung saan makikita yung muscle. Okay, in digestion and absorption, as we already mentioned earlier, no, Digestion is accomplished through mechanical as well as chemical digestion. Under mechanical, we have the stretching of the stomach wall, and nerve impulse will cause it to contract. Kaya tuloy-tuloy pa rin ang churning. There's secretion plus the mixing of waves and food is mixed with the food, and the processed food is collectively described as chyme. Kanina 'di ba sa mouth ang pinaka-end product is called the bolus prior to swallowing. But for the stomach, the end product is called chyme prior to its entry into the small intestine. Okay, so mechanical digestion is facilitated by chemical digestion carried out by the enzyme pepsin that combines with hydrochloric acid, which digests proteins, then turns them into peptides or small chains of amino acids. Okay, so gastric contents empties through the pyloric sphincter. The carbohydrates move fastest, proteins follows, and fats last. And once it is in the duodenum, there is a feedback inhibition of the stomach. Ang ibig sabihin ng feedback inhibition, hindi as the food evacuates and enters the duodenum, there will be a feedback that will stop further secretion of pepsin as well as hydrochloric acid. Kasi wala nang food doon eh. So why the need for additional pepsin and hydrochloric acid? So a feedback will inhibit further secretion of these very corrosive substances. In the stomach, there is little absorption of water. Stomach actually is not a place where food is really absorbed. No? There is little absorption of water and ions, but certain drugs gets absorbed by the stomach, especially when it is designed to act on the stomach. For example, yung Buscopan, Hyoscine Buscopan, wherein there is spasm. The stomach is somehow experiencing some form of miscoordinated muscular contraction that results into muscle spasm. Okay, ang Buscopan actually inhibits the spasmodic effect. It decreases muscular spasm. And it is one of those drugs that are absorbed by the stomach. Okay, now setting aside first the gastrointestinal tract, to let's discuss an accessory organ because it is directly related to the stomach. Its location is behind the stomach and produces pancreatic juice in acinar cells and passes into the duodenum. Actually, ang pancreatic juice sa duodenum siya pumapasok, hindi siya sa stomach. It enters the duodenum via the pancreatic duct. And how would we compare the pancreatic juice with the stomach secretions? Kung sa stomach, the secretions are acidic. In the pancreas, the secretions are basic. Okay, so primarily, the composition of the pancreatic juice is sodium bicarbonate. Okay, and another one, no, I would like to make you aware that the stomach, the pancreas that is involved in digestion is the exocrine part. Kasi 'di ba ang pancreas, dalawa ang functions ng pancreas eh. It's endocrine that has something to do with the secretion of insulin, but as an exocrine gland, it secretes pancreatic juice. Okay, so the pancreas also secretes a variety of many digestive enzymes. Among them is pancreatic lipase that breaks down fat, pancreatic amylase that breaks down starch, proteases that breaks down proteins that are activated by an enzyme enterokinase, and among these proteases are trypsinogen, carboxypeptidase, and RNAs and DNAs, which are actually proteases that breaks down the protein portion of RNA and DNA. Another accessory organ would be the liver and the gallbladder. For the liver, it weighs 1.4 kilograms or 3 pounds, making it the second largest organ in the body. And it is made up of a large right lobe plus three smaller parts. And its location is situated in the right upper quadrant. Kaya if you're feeling some form of pain here, it's most likely the liver or the gallbladder. If you're feeling pain here, it's most likely the transverse as well as the descending colon. Baka may nagko-constipate ka o maraming gases dito at maya't maya uutot ka. The liver is associated with bile production. And what we know about bile is that it emulsifies fats. Fats which cannot easily be dissolved by water. But to make it more digestible, bile actually breaks it down further because uh, it can do so through an emulsification process. And where is it produced? It is produced by hepatocytes or liver cells. And when it moves, no, it begins first to the bile canaliculi, flows through the bile duct and to the hepatic duct, going into the going into the cystic duct. And then, dadaan muna sa gallbladder because it does not directly go into the duodenum but first builds up into the gallbladder. And when there is a need, when there is additional need for bile, the gallbladder then secretes its further or contracts to secrete more of it into the cystic duct, common bile duct, and eventually the duodenum. Okay. So the functional unit of the liver is called the lobule. Kasi nga may mga lobes yan eh. And for each lobe, there is a cluster of lobules. It consists of hepatocytes in rows that vegetate around the central vein. The central vein actually would collect into the sinusoids, which are permeable capillaries with phagocytic copper cells that are between the cells. Yung copper cell, they actually originated from monocytes that decided to migrate into the liver and settled there permanently. So liver is very vascular. Okay? In fact, if you are hit by a bullet and it hits the liver, the chances for survival is very small if you are not taken to the hospital immediately because bleeding will be very profuse. In fact, sa mga 15 minutes upon injuring the liver, death ensues next or death follows next. Okay. Bile, as I described earlier, is a substance that breaks the apart clusters of fats to a process called emulsification that facilitates the absorption of fats. So saan galing yung bile? Actually, it comes from bilirubin. When RBCs or old and worn out RBCs are broken down, nare-recycle yung heme group from where bilirubin will be taken. Okay, when bile is digested, it parang the end product of digested bile is converted is stercobilin, which gives feces the brown color. No, kaya brown ang color ng ating ebak dahil sa stercobilin when bile is digested. Very much, di ba, pag ang blood nadadigest, it turns the feces black in color. And you will notice babies, medyo yellowish ang dumi ng baby because during that time, hindi pa ganun ka functional ang liver and hindi masyado pamataas ang fat content ng diets ng baby. Kaya ang color ng dumi ng baby ay yellow, meaning to say, bile is not yet actively secreted by an infant. Okay, bile salts are also reabsorbed into the blood in the small intestine and passes to the portal brain and return back to the liver. One of the problems associated with bile is the formation of gallstone. So, pag masyadong tumatagal, kung masyadong madaming bile sa gallbladder, there is a tendency for it to crystallize, to form gallstone. And when it does, it has a potential to obstruct the flow of blood or the flow of bile that results into a very painful and excruciating pain. Okay, this is a graphic representation of the relative position of the liver, gallbladder, and the duodenum. Okay, ito naman yung clusters ng hepatocytes that converge into a central vein as it drains several hepatic sinusoids. Ito naman, an enlarged or a magnified view of the sinusoid network that uh, drains blood into a central vein. Maraming function ng liver actually, no? It is involved in carbohydrate metabolism that helps in the assimilation, absorption, and assimilation of carbohydrates, especially when these polysaccharides are converted into glycogen. And we all know glycogen will be the precursor of blood glucose. Lipid metabolism, no? Sa lipid transport siya. Protein metabolism, no? Where it helps in the breakdown of protein and its eventual conversion to ammonia. Okay. And synthesize most plasma proteins in the form of albumin. Well, liver also removes many harmful substances. The reason why one of the organs that are subjected to an autopsy when one is suspected to have died from poisoning, it would be the liver. It helps detoxify alcohol, inactivates steroid and thyroid hormone, and eliminates some drugs like penicillins into bile. Okay, so liver din na tumutulong sa excretion ng bilirubin. Wherein portions of the hem during the production of bile ends up in the feces. The liver also store fat-soluble vitamins and minerals as well as activates vitamin D. Now for the small intestine, well, the length is on the average 10 feet long in a living person. It extends from the pylorus of the stomach to the cecum of the large intestine, and there are three major regions, namely the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And it is the site of most of the digestion and essentially all nutrient absorption takes place here. And the small intestine ends up in the ileocecal sphincter located in the right lower quadrant. This is a graphic depiction of the relative position and the appearance of the circular folds. Yung internal anatomy of the jejunum showing the circular folds seems to be similar to the rugae, but they're actually villi, or individually you call them villus pag plural villi. So although it's the equivalent of the rugae in the stomach, but these villi actually do not disappear. They permanently are visible because the intestine do not really get distended, unlike the stomach that can be fully distended because it is filled up with so much food. But for the small intestine, it doesn't happen. That is the reason why the villi remains visible all throughout. So the wall of the small intestine, same 4 layers but with certain modifications. Um, although simple columnar pareho ang stomach pati small intestine, but there is the additional of the microvilli. So the villi are the folds. Furthermore, extending the surface area of each villus would be the microvilli. There are also the so-called goblet cells that secrete mucus. And intestinal glands that secrete enzymes which completes digestion. And among them are secretin, cholecystokinin, glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptides. And also, this is where lymphatic tissues are situated. Ibig sabihin, when there's some pathogens, potential pathogens that may find entry into the blood because the intestine, the small intestine is the site of absorption. There is a portion of the immune system or lymphatic tissue that serves as a protection or a barrier that prevents potential pathogens from gaining entry. Meron din submucosa ang small intestine. And it has duodenal glands that secrete alkaline mucus which helps neutralize stomach acid. So meron din siyang circular folds, no? Which increases the surface area. Villi, which is the finger-like projection similar to the rugae. They also increase surface absorption area. They contain vessels that absorb nutrients. Dito kasi nagaganap yung absorption. No, for like arterioles, capillaries, venules, and even lacteals, which are lymph capillaries for lipid absorption. Okay, ito ang graphic representation ng intestinal wall structure. And in the digestion and the small intestine, meron just like the others, meron din siyang mechanical digestion. Segmentation, okay, is for mixing, and peristalsis for movement. Chemical digestion, meron tayong 2 liters for every ano ba? 2 liters per deciliter, no, of secretions. Alkaline chyme due to bicarbonates. So from the alkaline chyme, tama. So alkaline chyme due to bicarbonates actually helps neutralize acidity and enzymes produced by cells on the villi. Ano yung mga enzymes na to? Ito yung mga peptidases that break small peptides and disaccharidases such as sucrase, lactase, and galactase. No? Kung tutuusin, ang dami natin dapat matandaan dito sa digestive system. No? And generally, as the chyme enters the small intestine, absorption begins. And whatever needs to be completed is completed prior to the absorption. And 90% absorption of products of digestion occurs in the small intestine. Paano ma-digest ma-absorb? Yung mga starch or yung mga polysaccharides, they are absorbed in the form of monosaccharides as well as for the proteins, amino acids. For the fats, we have the fatty acids and monoglycerides. And for the nucleotides, we have the phosphate, sugar, and bases of RNAs and DNAs. So in summary, pagka carbohydrate digestion, ang nagke-carry out dito initially would be amylases, and in the small intestine when it ends, disaccharidases, and ang mga end products nito would be the breakdown of maltose, the breakdown of lactase, enzyme, lactase, the lactase that breaks down lactose, sucrase that breaks down glucose, sucrose, and syempre yung end product which would be the monosaccharides are in the form of glucose, galactose, and fructose. Sa proteins naman, in summary, ang mga enzymes for protein and fat digestion would be pepsin, trypsin, chymotrypsin, and carboxypeptidase. And for the fats, lipase siya, no, is particularly coming from the pancreatic juices. Okay, so how are nutrients absorbed? They actually are absorbed by diffusion, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Ang carbohydrates, once it is broken down into monosaccharides, are absorbed via the hepatic portal system going to the blood. For the proteins, they are absorbed in the region of the jejunum and ileum. Siyempre, they have to be broken down into amino acids where they also get passes through the hepatic portal system going to the liver. And ganun din, no? Sa lipids, the short-chain fatty acids or monoglycerides present in the blood, they are further coated by proteins in chylomicrons. They travel through the lacteals, lymphatics, then going to the blood. Water and salt. Well, their absorption is primarily osmosis that accompanies other nutrients. Vitamins, yung mga fat soluble, they are absorbed with fat. But if they are water soluble, they are absorbed through simple diffusion. For vitamin B12, they combine with intrinsic factor for transport to the duodenum and jejunum, and finally can be absorbed by active transport in the ileum. Now, this is a graphic representation, but you have to further uh, view this and understand how the flow chart or the process flow takes place. Ito yung mga lacteals that facilitates the absorption of fats to the lymph, to the lymphatic system. Okay, so patapos na tayo, nasa large intestine na tayo, no? So sa large intestine, the large intestine is also divided into 4 regions, namely the cecum, the colon, the rectum, and the anus or anus canal. Well, wall, standard, same as the others. It contains 4 layers, beginning with the mucosa in the innermost, lined with goblet cells that secrete mucus, muscularis, although the longitudinal layer is incomplete. Okay, and this is how the large intestine looks like. So it all begins here. Kumbaga, papasok from the small intestine, okay, ascending colon, transverse, descending, sigmoid, rectum, and the anus. Okay. So mapapansin niyo dito sa anus, no? The sphincter actually consists of external and internal. Between these two, internal is involuntary while external is voluntary. Okay, so meaning to say, when the internal anal sphincter relaxes, there is already that strong urge to defecate, but it still can still be prevented when you contract the external anal sphincter, especially if you feel that the location or the situation is not the ideal time and place to defecate. Okay, the large intestine also is a place where digestion can takes place as well as absorption. Okay, so yung ileocecal sphincter, that means the sphincter between the ileum of the small intestine and the cecum of the large intestine limits the rate of emptying of absorbed food into the ileum. Peristalsis is very slow, but mass peristalsis can be triggered by the presence of food in the stomach and the waste is moved from mid-colon into the rectum. Okay, mabilis ang peristalsis dito. And this is where bacterial digestion takes place. It produces some B vitamins plus vitamin K. It produces gas, kaya yung umuutot tayo. And the colon can also absorb salt together with water. Defecation reflex, no? 'Di ba meron tayong stretch of the rectum wall. Okay? There is a neural reflex that triggers the contraction of the longitudinal muscle, and with this combined pressure together with parasympathetic activity, it relaxes the internal anal sphincter. And if the external anal sphincter is made to relax, defecation is accomplished. And it is facilitated further by the contraction of the diaphragm and abdominal muscles that aids in defecation. Okay. So in the phases of digestion, in controlling digestion, the rule is activate forward and inhibit behind. Meaning to say, beginning from up there, going there, pag nag-move forward ka, i-inhibit mo dapat yung dadaanan na para talagang umandar yung digestive process. And it is divided into three phases, such as the cephalic phase, which is triggered by smell and the sight of food, where several cranial nerves are stimulated. And in the gastric phase, where the food is already in the stomach, and the intestinal phase, where the intestinal hormones play a key role in the absorption of the nutrients. Okay, so mga hormones that aid in digestion are secretin and cholecystokinin. Okay, sa mga may edad na, no, sa mga tumatanda, uh, gastrointestinal secretion decreases and the motility and strength of the responses decreases as well. The reason why, well, older people tend to lose appetite. There is the risk of periodontal disease, difficulty swallowing, hernia, gastritis, and peptic ulcer. There is also the increased risk for gallbladder problems, cirrhosis of liver, pancreatitis, constipation, hemorrhoids, and diverticulitis. Wow, no? Medyo mahaba ang ating digestive system. And I do hope you have learned something new from our lesson for today. Thank you very much. If ever there are questions that you would like to raise, um, please feel free to post it to email me in schoolbook so that I can answer it and probably share it with your classmates as well. Thank you very much and stay safe. Okay? Goodbye, everyone.